I wanted to lay this out because we had a caller in the previous hour who asked Senator Sanders, who said words to the effect of, I was born back in the 60s, or I was alive in the 60s, and I remember the 70s, there were all these riots, and people were saying, enough already, we're not going to take it anymore, and why aren't people rioting now? And I would like to share my take on that. I mean, Bernie had his own, and I think he was spot on. But here, let me add my take on this as well, on that question. Not on Bernie's answer, but on that question. Most of the people who were rioting in the 70s, and I lived through this. In fact, the neighborhood of Detroit that burned down, about 10 square blocks that burned down, is where I lived when I was 1 and 2 years old, when I was a little kid. It was at that time. It was a very poor neighborhood when it burned down. It was a very poor neighborhood when I lived there. My parents had just gotten married, or they'd been married for a year or so, a couple of years, and Dad was traveling around the state looking for work. It was a tough time. This was 53. It must have been 52, 53, and it was basically a Jewish ghetto. It was a community that was mostly immigrants, mostly German immigrants, Holocaust survivors and whatnot. And in fact, the first language that I spoke with any reasonable fluency was not English, it was Yiddish, because both my parents were working, and the couple across the hall watched me during the day, and they spoke Yiddish. And so now it's funny, I go to Germany or I go to Israel, and I speak a little bit of German and I speak a little bit of Hebrew, and when I speak it, my accent, the Hanukkah, the ability to make those sounds is like absolutely natural to me because I learned it when I was 2 years old. I make those, and people just assume that I'm much more fluent than I actually am because my pronunciation is pretty amazing, or pretty good, let's say. It's not certainly not amazing. So anyhow, I remember when Detroit burned. I remember when that neighborhood burned, and when that neighborhood went down in flames, it was entirely African-American, as was Watts, as was Harlem. I mean, you had cities across America that were burning, and they were African-American communities. Why? And this is, it begs the question, again, why was Greece on fire last year? Now, there wasn't so much of a racial divide, but why was Greece on fire? James Chowning Davies, who was born in 1918 and as far as I can tell is still alive, he was a professor at the University of Oregon for quite some time, came up with a theory of revolutions, which has been incorporated into and referred to as the J-curve by a variety of people. And basically what he said was that revolution doesn't come about when life is terrible for people. Instead, revolution comes about when people not just expect, but believe, deep down inside believe, that life is going to get better or is getting better, and it doesn't happen. That's when you have revolution. So, let's apply this to the United States. I mean, African Americans had pretty miserable lives for large chunks of American history, and there were some efforts at revolution, but nothing as, well, I shouldn't say nothing as large or as sustained as the 70s, but that was certainly a flashpoint. Why? Because in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court said no more segregated schools, no more legal apartheid in the United States. And then in 1966, 67, 68, there was a series of civil rights laws, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, that said no, you can't you can't segregate people in commerce. This was actually part of the 1960s Nixon-Kennedy debate. We've played that clip before, and in fact, it might be worth revisiting, just so you get a sense of what the time was like, so you understand what I'm saying here. Where Richard Nixon, the question was, what are we going to do about the fact that the South, in particular, is segregated? What's the deal with the segregated South? And Nixon said, and the questioner in the debate said, what would you do about this? And Nixon basically said, I would ask the businessmen to stop being bad. And Kennedy said, I would use the law and kick their butt. And that was the big, that historically has been the difference in conservatives and between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. Do you have a clip? Yeah, it's from the Nixon-Kennedy debate. Let's play it and see if that's the clip.
I am proposing today a new national health strategy.
No, that's not it. No, it's I think it's titled Nixon-Kennedy debate, or 1960 debate. But in any case, I told you the story about it, so you don't have to hear it. So what had happened as a consequence of this, I mean, this has been part of the presidential debate in 1960. The Supreme Court decision was in 1954. You had the Civil Rights Acts passed throughout the 60s. You had the Great Society programs that lifted a quarter to a half of all the people in America in poverty out of poverty. And so there was this level of expectation in the African American community that within a generation, within a decade, within a very short period of time, we're going to start seeing that same middle class life that white America had had for the previous 20, 30 years. And it didn't happen because redlining was still happening. Discrimination was still happening. Racism was alive and well. The Republicans were making a comeback. Nixon had come up with this Southern strategy. I mean, it was just the whole thing. And so you had a mini revolution. You look at the same thing. You can go back to the French Revolution. The French Revolution wasn't about starvation. Yeah, times were tough, but they've been far tougher at other times. It was about the expectation. They had seen our revolution. They had seen an American middle class, and they said, why can't we have that? In fact, they fully expected that. Louis the 16th essentially promised it to them, and they didn't get it. The same thing with the Greeks. The Greeks, they were expecting that life was going to, every generation is going to do better than the previous generation. Then the banksters come along and crash their economy, and then to add insult to injury, the banksters say, by the way, we're not paying for the damage we did. Average working people have to pay for the damage we did. And so not only did life get better, it got worse, but it wasn't that life got worse, it was that the expectation was violated. Now, this is a very back-of-the-envelope, super simplistic perspective. But the important point is that revolution happens, sometimes violently, sometimes nonviolently. And I would say that the revolution of 1932 is an example of nonviolent revolution. The election of Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal. The revolution happens when it's basically provoked or happened. I mean, you argued the actual revolution happened in 1930-31. When the bonus army, when the occupation movement of that generation, when the bonus army camped out from the White House all the way down to the Potomac River and said, we're not going to leave. And finally, in 1931, President Herbert Hoover, maybe it was 32, President Herbert Hoover had General Eisenhower and General, what's his name from the Pacific Theater, Westmoreland? No. MacArthur, General MacArthur, ride in there with tanks and horses, and a couple of people had died, and they burned them out, basically. I mean, they did away with that Occupy movement. That was the revolution. The response to that revolution was the New Deal. So the question in my mind is, at what point are people's expectations, particularly given the election of a president who campaigned on hope and change and who has been promising that things are going to get better, when he is confronted by an absolutely immovable Republican Party that says, no, we are going to block anything that makes things better. Every single significant piece of legislation in the first 2 years of the Obama presidency that successfully got out of the House of Representatives that would have helped the economy were blocked by Republicans in the Senate. And then for the last 2 years of the Obama presidency, the Republicans controlled the House, and not one single jobs bill was passed. Instead, we saw legislation about gay marriage and to repeal Obamacare. And now the same thing. The first bill that was introduced in the House of Representatives yesterday by Michelle Bachmann was to repeal Obamacare. How long is it going to be before people's expectations collide with reality?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
In my opinion, if the Republicans continue this obstruction, it's going to be within the next year or two or three at the most.